flash, then another. Moments later, the sound arrived, low, rolling, violent. Somewhere deep inside Iran, air defense systems came alive too late. Radar screens flickered. Operators stared at blips moving faster than thought. Then, the impacts. Precision strikes slammed into hardened facilities, places that for years had existed in secrecy and suspicion. Concrete shattered, fire climbed into the dark, and within minutes, the world understood what was happening. Israel had just launched a direct attack on Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Not a warning, not a message, a decision. Because for years, decades even, there had been one question no one could answer with certainty. How close is Iran to a nuclear weapon? Close enough to justify war, or still far enough that this strike changes everything? The truth is, this moment didn't begin tonight. It began years earlier, in laboratories, in negotiations, in shadows, and in a quiet, persistent claim that Iran was always just months away. For decades, Iran has told a very different story. Not one of weapons, but of energy. Inside government statements, diplomatic meetings, and televised speeches, the message has remained remarkably consistent. Iran's nuclear program, they insist, is peaceful, civilian, necessary. A nation of more than 80 million people, growing, industrializing, consuming energy at an increasing rate, cannot rely forever on oil alone. Oil runs out, demand rises, infrastructure ages. So Iran turned to nuclear power. Reactors like the one at Bushehr were presented as symbols of progress, of independence, of a future not controlled by foreign fuel supplies. And under international law, Iran has a point. As a signatory of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, it claims the right to develop nuclear energy for civilian purposes, including the ability to enrich uranium. To Tehran, enrichment is not a threat, it is sovereignty, a red line. No. Enrichment, no deal. The phrase has been repeated again and again in negotiations, because to give it up would mean giving up control over its own energy, and, in a deeper sense, its independence. Iranian officials have gone even further. They deny ever pursuing nuclear weapons at all, calling the accusations misunderstandings or deliberate distortions. Even today, they maintain that every step, every centrifuge, every facility, every kilogram of uranium is part of a civilian program, nothing more. And yet, there is one detail that continues to unsettle observers, because while nuclear energy typically requires uranium enriched to just a few percent, Iran has pushed far beyond that, far enough that the line between peaceful and military begins to blur. But the story does not begin with power plants. It begins in secrecy. In the early 2000s, intelligence agencies began uncovering something far more concerning, an organized effort inside Iran that appeared to go beyond civilian energy. It was called the AMAD program, a coordinated project, according to international assessments, designed not to generate electricity, but to explore the development of a nuclear weapon, not a reactor, a warhead. Documents, later seized and analyzed, pointed to experiments, calculations, designs, work that had no clear civilian purpose. At the center of it all was one man, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, a physicist, a military figure, a name that would surface again and again in intelligence reports. To some, he was simply a scientist. To others, the architect of Iran's nuclear ambitions. Then, in 2003, something changed. The program, at least officially, was shut down. Dismantled. Iran has long pointed to that moment as proof that whatever may have existed no longer does, that any military dimension to its nuclear work ended there. And for a time, that explanation held, but not completely. Because while the structure of AMAD may have disappeared, many believe the knowledge did not, the personnel did not, and the intent, whatever it once was, may not have vanished either. Instead, it may have evolved. After 2003, a new organization emerged, less visible, less defined, the Organization of Defensive Innovation and Research. Iran denies it had any military role, but to outside observers, it looked familiar. A continuation, a reorganization, a way to preserve expertise without attracting the same attention. Years later, in 2020, Fakhrizadeh was assassinated in a covert operation widely attributed to Israel. A quiet, targeted killing, one that raised a simple, unsettling question. If the program had truly ended nearly 2 decades earlier, why eliminate the man who once led it? And that question still lingers, because in the shadows of Iran's nuclear history, nothing seems to disappear completely. It only becomes harder to see. But this story is not only about governments, scientists, or secret programs. It is also about a nation, because inside Iran, the nuclear program is not universally feared. In many ways, it is supported, even among those who oppose the government itself. For years, Iran has lived under pressure, sanctions, isolation, the constant threat of conflict. Its economy strained, its global position contested. And in that environment, nuclear capability, at least on the surface, represents something powerful: self-reliance, security, control. To many Iranians, the program is not about building a bomb. It is about ensuring that no foreign power can dictate the country's future. A form of protection, a guarantee that Iran cannot be easily threatened or invaded or cornered. There is a word sometimes used by analysts to describe this idea: sanctuarization. The belief that advanced capability, even without a weapon, can make a nation untouchable, and history reinforces that perception. Countries that possess nuclear weapons are rarely invaded. They operate under a different set of rules, a different kind of caution. So even without openly pursuing a bomb, the knowledge, the infrastructure, the potential, it carries weight: political weight, strategic weight, psychological weight. Inside Iran, that weight translates into something close to consensus, not necessarily support for war, but support for capability, support for the right to reach the threshold, even if never crossing it. And that is where the tension begins to sharpen. Because from the outside, that same capability looks very different. To Israel, to the United States, to much of Europe, it does not look like protection. It looks like proximity. A nation moving closer and closer to a line it claims it will never cross. And the closer it gets, the harder it becomes for others to wait and see. Because at a certain point, the difference between having a nuclear program and having a nuclear weapon may only be time. At the center of this entire question is a number, a percentage. Because not all uranium is the same. In its natural state, uranium is mostly unusable for both energy and weapons. It must be processed, refined, through a method known as enrichment. And that process changes everything. For civilian nuclear power, the requirement is relatively low, around 3 to 5%. At that level, uranium can fuel reactors, generate electricity, sustain a peaceful energy program. That is the standard. That is what most countries operate within. But beyond that point, the meaning begins to shift. At 20%, uranium is no longer typical for civilian use. It becomes sensitive, concerning. At 60%, it becomes something else entirely. Not yet a weapon, but no longer easily explained as peaceful. Because the jump from natural uranium to 60% is the hardest part, the most time-consuming, the most technically demanding. And once that threshold is reached, the final step to 90% weapons grade becomes significantly faster, not trivial, but far easier than everything that came before. This is why enrichment levels matter so much, not because 60% is a bomb, but because it places a country very close to the final step. And today, Iran has reached that level, producing uranium enriched up to 60%, far beyond what is needed for energy. A fact confirmed by international inspectors. A fact that has reshaped the entire conversation. Because now, the question is no longer theoretical. It is no longer about whether Iran could one day approach weapons capability. It is about how quickly it could cross that last remaining gap. Weeks, months, longer? No one can say for certain, but one thing is clear: the distance between Iran's current position and a nuclear weapon has never been smaller. But enrichment alone does not tell the full story. Because there is another factor, just as important: quantity. How much material exists? How much has already been produced and stored? Because even if a country reaches high levels of enrichment, without enough material, there is no weapon. And this is where the situation becomes far more serious. According to international inspectors, Iran is no longer dealing with small amounts. It has accumulated a significant stockpile of uranium enriched to 60%, roughly 274 kilograms. That number changes everything. Because at that level of enrichment, the remaining step to weapons grade is relatively small. And with that quantity, theoretically, it could be enough for multiple nuclear devices. Not one, several, at least on paper. But this is where the reality becomes more complicated. Because enriched uranium is not a bomb, not yet. Turning that material into a functioning nuclear weapon requires additional steps, highly complex ones. The uranium must be further enriched, then converted into a metallic form, shaped, engineered into a precise configuration, and integrated into a delivery system that can survive launch and detonate correctly. Each of these steps introduces new challenges, new risks, new points of failure, and most importantly, new time. So while the stockpile suggests potential, it does not confirm capability, not fully. This is the gap that often gets lost in public discussion, the difference between having enough material and having an actual weapon ready to use. Still, the numbers matter, because the more material exists, the less time is needed to act. The margin for detection shrinks, the window for response narrows, and the line between preparation and execution becomes dangerously thin. So the question is no longer just about enrichment, it is about readiness. How quickly that stockpile could be turned into something far more dangerous, and whether anyone would know before it happens. So how long would it actually take? That is the question at the center of everything. Not capability, not intent, time. Because in theory, once a country has both high enrichment and sufficient material, the clock begins to matter more than anything else. And yet, when experts are asked for an answer, the responses rarely agree. Some say a few months, others say closer to a year. Enough time, perhaps, for detection, for pressure, for intervention. But then there's another statement, one that complicates everything, a quiet admission from analysts who have followed this program for decades, that Iran has been a few months away for nearly 15 years, the same warning, repeated again and again, across different administrations, different intelligence reports, different moments of crisis, always close, but never quite there. So which version is true? Is Iran on the verge of a breakthrough, or is the timeline itself misunderstood? Because building a nuclear weapon is not a single step. It is a chain of decisions, technical, political, strategic. At any point along that chain, progress can slow, or stop, or reverse. A country may develop the capability without ever choosing to complete the weapon. It may remain just below the threshold, intentionally, close enough to signal power, but far enough to avoid consequences. This is sometimes called a threshold state, a position of ambiguity, where the line exists, but is never crossed, and Iran may be operating precisely in that space, not rushing toward a bomb, but ensuring that, if it ever chose to, the path would be short, which makes the timeline difficult to measure, because it depends on something no satellite can see, no inspector can verify, no intelligence agency can fully predict. Intent, not what Iran can do, but what it will decide to do, and when, and until that decision is made. The timeline will remain what it has always been, unclear, uncertain, and dangerously open to interpretation. If this were only about numbers, the world would have answers. But it isn't. Because much of Iran's nuclear program exists in a space that cannot be fully observed, a space shaped by limits, by gaps, by what is not seen. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, is the only body authorized to inspect Iran's nuclear facilities, to verify, to monitor, to ensure that what is declared matches reality. But in recent years, those inspections have become increasingly difficult. Access has been restricted, Cameras removed, data withheld, and in some cases, locations have simply not been declared at all. Sites where traces of uranium have been detected, but no clear explanation has been provided. Particles, residue, evidence that something happened there, but not what, or when, or why. This is where uncertainty begins to deepen. Because without full visibility, even small discrepancies become significant. A missing record, an unexplained sample, a delay in access. Each one on its own might mean little, but together, they create a pattern that the IAEA itself has described as a lack of credible answers, concerns over concealment efforts, references to sanitization, locations that appear to have been cleaned before inspectors arrived. And that word, sanitization, carries weight, because it suggests not just secrecy, but intent to hide. From Iran's perspective, these actions can be explained differently. Protection, security, a response to years of cyber attacks, sabotage, and targeted assassinations, a way to shield sensitive infrastructure from hostile actors. But from the outside, the interpretation shifts, because transparency builds trust, and the absence of transparency does the opposite. It invites suspicion, it amplifies worst-case assumptions, and it forces other nations to make decisions without complete information. That is what makes secrecy so dangerous in this context, not just what it hides, but what it creates in its absence. Because when the world cannot see clearly, it begins to imagine. And in matters of nuclear weapons, imagination tends to move in only one direction: toward risk, toward threat, toward the possibility that something is happening just out of sight. And if that possibility feels real enough, it can become justification for pressure, for escalation, even for war, not because something has been proven, but because something cannot be ruled out. For a moment, there was a path forward. In 2015, after years of negotiations, Iran reached an agreement with 6 world powers: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Russia, China. Together, they formed what became known as the nuclear deal. The goal was simple in theory: limit Iran's nuclear program. In exchange for relief, sanctions would be lifted, Iran's economy would reopen, and in return, strict boundaries would be placed on enrichment, on stockpiles, on access, inspections would increase, transparency would improve, and for a time, it worked. Iran reduced its enrichment levels, scaled back its stockpile, allowed international monitors deeper access than ever before. The tension did not disappear, but it stabilized. The program slowed, the timeline extended. The risk, at least temporarily, was pushed further away. Then, in 2018, the agreement collapsed. The United States withdrew. Sanctions returned, pressure intensified, and with that, the balance broke. Because from Iran's perspective, the deal had failed. The benefits disappeared, but the restrictions remained. So step by step, those restrictions were lifted, enrichment resumed, then increased, from low levels to higher ones, from 3.5% to 4.5%, then beyond. Centrifuges restarted, new ones installed. The program, once constrained, began moving forward again, faster, more openly, and with each step the distance that had once been extended began to shrink, not suddenly, but steadily. And now, years later, the consequences of that collapse are clear. The agreement that once delayed the timeline is no longer in place, and without it, there is nothing holding that timeline back. Even after the deal collapsed, there was still time. Time to rebuild, time to renegotiate, time to slow everything down again. And in early 2025, that effort quietly resumed. Talks reopened between the United States and Iran, not in headlines, but behind closed doors, in neutral locations, through intermediaries. Carefully worded proposals passed back and forth. The objective was familiar: reduce Iran's nuclear capability in exchange for relief. Again. But this time, the gap had grown wider because both sides had changed. The United States returned with a harder position: no enrichment, not reduced, not limited, zero, a complete rollback of Iran's nuclear capacity. From Iran's perspective, that was impossible, because enrichment was no longer just technical. It had become symbolic, a line that couldn't be crossed. No enrichment, no deal. The same phrase, the same position. And so the negotiations stalled, round after round, statements made, then repeated, then rejected. By May, the fifth round of talks ended without progress. No breakthrough, no compromise, only distance. And still, there was one more meeting scheduled, one more attempt, set for June 15th in Oman. A final opportunity, perhaps, to prevent what might come next. But that meeting never happened, because before diplomats could sit down again, events moved faster than negotiation. The strikes began. And in that moment, diplomacy didn't just fail, it was overtaken. It happened in the dark, without warning, without confirmation. Only the sound came first, distant at first, then unmistakable. Explosions, multiple, coordinated, across locations that had long been watched, analyzed, debated. Facilities tied to Iran's nuclear program, struck almost simultaneously. Israeli aircraft had crossed into action, not to signal, not to deter, but to destroy. The targets were not random, they were precise. Infrastructure, enrichment sites, locations believed to be critical to Iran's nuclear capability. Years of intelligence, satellites, cyber operations, human sources, compressed into a single operation. Minutes. That was all it took to turn suspicion into action. From Israel's perspective, the reasoning was clear. If the timeline was uncertain, if the visibility was incomplete, if the threshold was approaching, then waiting carried its own risk. A risk too great to accept. Because once a nation crosses that final line, once a weapon exists, the options disappear. Prevention becomes deterrence, and deterrence is far more dangerous. So the strike was framed as necessary, preventive, a way to stop something before it could happen. But that justification depends on one assumption, that Iran was close enough to make action unavoidable. And that is the question that remains, because if Iran was truly on the verge of a nuclear weapon, then this was a delay, a disruption, a calculated intervention. But if it was not, if the timeline was still uncertain, if the intent was still unresolved, then this moment may represent something else entirely. Not the prevention of a war, but the beginning of one. And now, as the smoke settles, the same question returns, only heavier than before. Not just how close Iran was, but whether this strike has brought the world closer to the very outcome it was meant to prevent. So, how close is Iran really? The answer is not simple, because it depends on what you mean by close. If the question is technical capability, then yes, Iran is closer than it has ever been. It has enriched uranium far beyond civilian levels. It has built the infrastructure. It has accumulated material that could, if taken further, be used for multiple weapons. That much is clear. But capability is only one part of the equation. Because if the question is, does Iran actually have a nuclear weapon? The answer is no. There is no confirmed evidence of a completed bomb, no verified test, no proof of a fully assembled warhead, and even intelligence assessments acknowledge something critical. There are still gaps, uncertainties, missing pieces in what can be observed and verified. And then there's the final question, the one that matters most. Not what Iran can do, but what it intends to do. Because building a nuclear weapon is not inevitable. It is a choice, a decision that carries consequences far beyond the technology itself. And right now, that decision remains unknown, which leaves the world in a position unlike any other. Iran is not a nuclear power, but it is no longer far from becoming one. It exists in between, in a space defined not by certainty, but by possibility. The greatest danger is not what we know. It is what we don't, because nuclear weapons are not just about physics, or centrifuges, or percentages. They are about perception, about how one nation interprets another's intentions without ever seeing them clearly. And in that uncertainty, decisions are made, faster, harsher, more final. A program that may not yet be a weapon can still be treated as one. A capability that may never be used can still trigger a response. And once that response begins, it cannot easily be reversed. This is the paradox at the center of it all. The world is not reacting to certainty, it is reacting to the fear of what might be true. Because sometimes the most dangerous moment is not when a nuclear weapon exists, but when everyone believes it might.